Alright, we're out here working on the RX-7 again today. So my project of today is to get the axle bearings pressed onto the axle shafts here. So here I kind of have the process laid out. These are my GSLSE axle shafts that have been cleaned. Just try to get them as clean as possible as you can. Try to clean up where the bearings slide onto the axles themselves. So the first step that I did was to paint my axle shaft retainer and the dust cover, just because that's what you can kind of see. You can't really see the retainer, but I did it anyways. The dust cover, though, you can see the back of a lot, so I wanted that to match the freshly painted axle carrier. So the first thing you do to install the back bearings are to place the axle shaft retainer back on the dust cover here. As you can see, these notches line up with a notch in the brake dust cover. So that lines up, and then all the holes line up correctly right there. Then this goes upside down as an assembly over the axle shaft itself, like this one. So that's the first thing to go on when you're doing this. The next thing you put on here, this is the axle shaft bearing spacer. It's just generally called a bearing spacer. This is the rear axle bearing itself, and then this is the rear axle bearing collar retainer. A lot of places call it a collar or a retainer. First thing to go on here is the spacer itself. As you can see, it's tapered on one side and not on the other. So the tapered side goes down onto the shaft here, like so. Then the bearing itself will get pressed on. It doesn't matter which way you do it. Bearing goes on like such. Then the last thing to go on is the collar. I put the tapered side goes up when you're looking at it this way. So collar will go on like that. So that's the assembly order that you put these together in. If you forget, which I did, to put the axle shaft retainer and the dust brake cover on before you put the bearing on, you will not be able to get it on there. You can see my dust covers are actually cut in half. That's not a big deal because they get bolted down, so it doesn't really matter. It's not going to do anything. But you cannot fit this over the bearing itself. I will show you here a visual of what I mean. This is the assembly together, and then this is the bearing. The bearing is quite a bit bigger, the outer diameter, so you will not be able to put this on after you press the bearing on, which I did. So I had to order a new bearing. You should be able to put... You might be able to squeeze the spacer by, but I wouldn't do it. I put it on after you put those on. So that's the assembly order that these go into. Next we will go and press them on. Alright, here we have a press that I'm going to use here. Just a traditional press here. What I'm going to do is put the axle bearing in these V blocks here, close them together, and then once they're in there, I'm going to press the axle shaft downwards onto the bearing, instead of some people pressing the bearing onto the shaft with a long pipe. I'm avoiding buying the pipe by doing this method. It should work out just fine here. I will grab another shot here once I have everything all set up. Alright, here I have everything set up here. I have some blocks in between the leveler and the hydraulic pump itself. Then the axle bearing retainer, dust cover. These do not need to be pressed. The spacer is underneath here. Here it is, and here's the bearing. Those will be slid upwards onto the shaft itself. I will be able to record this here in just a second. Here, let me put the camera down here. Awesome. So here is one bearing done. As you can see, the spacer itself is able to move there, but I did feel it bottom out in the pump, and I could also, I don't know if you could see it, but I could feel it. You can also kind of hear when it stops. So that's how you press the bearing on. I will throw on a collar here and get another shot of that. Here I'm going to show that these V-blocks that I'm using here, actually the V in the middle of these is a little too big. The bearing collar soffit here I do not feel would be safe to press on because it would slip. These two after pressure would just split. So I got extremely lucky here, thanks to Shane. He kept this, I don't even know what this is, it looks like an oil pump gear or something like that. This just so happens to be the perfect size to be able to sit on the collar itself. Just barely fits on there, and the outside diameter is big enough to fit in the V-block. So let me throw that on and I'll grab another shot of that. Alright, here is that piece that I found resting on the collar here. So each one of those little fingers is grabbing the collar. Then this outer diameter is big enough to fit in the V-block safely. So here I'm going to press on this setup real quick. There, she's bottomed out. So that is the setup of what it looks like once you have everything all pressed on there correctly. I could feel definitely that there's more pressure required to put on the collar than the bearing. I will pull it off and get one final shot. Here's what this setup looks like completely assembled here. The axle carrier again, dust cover, axle bearing spacer, axle bearing, and the axle bearing collar retainer right here. As you can see, they're all sitting flush like they should, all tight against each other. This one is the same way. Nothing's crooked, nothing's not spinning. They're both working as they should. This one you can see I have a little bit of movement in the spacer. This one I do not. I don't think that's a big deal. I could see that in this one there was some scrape marks on it, but I think I'm going to press that one back in just to be safe. Other than that, everything should have lined up the correct way. For this one, I'm just going to see if I can tighten up the collar a little bit, which will push on the bearing, which will push on that a little bit. If not, it's not a huge deal. That's how you do that one.